Thanks for having me.
In your book, you've taken a look at why the world has failed to come to an agreement on reducing greenhouse gas emissions. What conclusions have you come to?
Well, what I found is that what best explains this epic failure, the reason our governments have allowed global emissions to increase by 61% in the very time period when they were negotiating to reduce emissions, is really a case of epic bad timing, that climate change landed on our laps decisively in the late 1980s. 1988 was the first year that governments began meeting towards reducing emissions. That was the year the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change was formed. Now, that was also the year that the first free trade agreement was signed between Canada and the U.S. That became the prototype for free trade deals around the world. And the year later, the Berlin Wall collapsed. So this was the triumphant moment for what Joseph Stiglitz has called market fundamentalism. And we know the policies at the heart of this revolution. They're privatization, deregulation, keeping corporate taxes low, really just liberating capital to scour the world for the cheapest possible production conditions. And in every way that conflicted with what we needed to do to confront the climate crisis, because of course we did need to intervene in the market and we did need to act collectively. We needed to tell polluters that they had to stop polluting, and all of this was really ideologically heretical in this period. So we tried to solve climate change through these sort of gentle market mechanisms like cap and trade, emission trading, even a gentle carbon tax, but not actually forcing the polluters to pay and closing off carbon frontiers.
But since the end of the Cold War, nations are actually talking to each other more. There are more international forums. We're trading with each other more. Nations like the US and China have more in common than they did before. Isn't there an argument that there's never been a better time to come to an agreement?
Well, it's certainly possible for our governments to reach agreements when those agreements are in the interest of international capital. So the idea that they just can't agree on anything is simply not true, because in the same years that they have been failing so spectacularly to come up with binding climate agreements with real penalties for failing to comply, they built the World Trade Organization, a robust system guiding the flow of goods and services, and that has real penalties. But in many ways, these systems conflict with one another. I have a chapter in the book about how at the same time as governments go to the UN climate summits and launch accusations at one another about how they aren't doing enough and why should the US do anything about climate change when China isn't, and vice versa. At the World Trade Organization, these same governments have been lodging grievances against each other for subsidizing renewable energy. My country, Canada, or Canada as it's called over there, was challenged by the European Union and Japan for having a very good green energy program in the province of Ontario, which set bold emission reduction targets, but also had requirements that a certain percentage of solar panels and wind turbines be produced locally so that it created jobs. And this was challenged successfully at the World Trade Organization. So yes, they can agree, but they agree when it is in the interest of large transnational capital. So that is really the crux of the issue.
You believe our economic model is waging war against life on Earth, and you want that economic system to undergo a radical overhaul. What kind of changes do you want to see made?
We need to have a more strategic economy where we contract the areas that are dangerous, and we know they're dangerous, and that means saying no to new fossil fuel frontiers. And then we need to expand the parts of the economy that are already low carbon. So that means investing in the public sphere like healthcare, and also the parts of our public sphere that we're going to need more than ever as we face extreme weather, because we've already locked in a good deal of extreme weather. So that means we need more firefighters. That means we need more frontline workers. And we also need huge renewable energy projects and public transit and all the tools that will get us off fossil fuels.
Is one of those radical options, in your eyes, degrowth, a contraction of our economies? Kevin Anderson, whose work you rely on in your book, has previously argued for planned recessions to reduce emissions. Are you advocating for that?
Well, you know, I'm here in London, and I've actually had several meetings with Kevin Anderson and Alice Bose-Larkin from the Tyndall Center specifically about this. And, you know, they use the word strategic degrowth. I think just a strategic economy or a deliberate economy is what we're talking about, because they don't think all aspects of our economy should contract. When they say strategic, they mean we need to shrink the parts of our economy that use up the most natural resources, that are just based on mindless consumption, and we need to expand the parts of our economy that are already low carbon and that are going to get us off fossil fuels. So, I think we can overemphasize the degrowth in a sense, because the message that people get is, well, they're going to lose everything. And that's not true, because the parts of our economy that are most intimately connected with well-being can be expanded because they're already low carbon. But are we going to have to consume less? Are we, not everyone, but high consumers like me and I assume you, are we going to have to consume less? Yes, we are.
Are you saying that Australia needs to shut down its coal industry?
Australia, like Canada, needs to close off these new carbon frontiers. I'm a board member of a great climate organization called 350.org, and we have a slogan, which is, when you're in a hole, stop digging. There's research out of Stanford University that I quote in the book that tells us that we can get to 100% renewable energy by 2030. So the technology is there. The economics are getting better every day. It's getting cheaper every day. But we're not going to get there if we keep making the problem worse. When I interviewed Mark Jacobson, who's the author of that pivotal study, I said, can we get there without using fracked natural gas? Because of course we're always told that we need to dig up fossil fuels in the interim. And what he says is we can get there with the conventionals right now. So Australia absolutely should not be in the middle of a fracking frenzy. It should not be opening new coal mines. It should not be exporting coal as demand for it declines. And so the key thing here is that if we're serious about a renewable energy transition, we can't be locking in more dirty energy infrastructure. All of these are multi-billion-dollar projects. And when fossil fuel companies, whether they're coal companies or tar sands companies or gas companies, build a massive new export terminal or a massive new coal mine or a massive new pipeline, whatever it is, they are planning for this infrastructure to be around for between 25 and 40 years. We need to be off fossil fuels by mid-century. And this is why the International Energy Agency says we are in this very narrow window. And they actually talk about 2017, which is a very scary year, because they say it's after that year that the infrastructure, the dirty energy infrastructure, becomes locked in. Because once the investment is made, it becomes very, very difficult to convince companies to abandon those investments, right? Because they've amortized the value of those investments over decades. I guess the short answer is, yeah, I think Australia, as well as other governments in the industrialized world, need to close off new carbon frontiers.
But how do you sell that to the people? In Australia, the former government couldn't even sell a carbon tax that cost the average household $4 a week on their energy bills. How do you go about convincing people that they should shut down an industry that generates growth, jobs and wealth?
Well, this is about whether or not you put in new infrastructure and open new mines. As far as existing jobs and existing infrastructure, it should be managed for wind down, which means that you have to have a just transition. I mean, the good news is that many of the jobs working in the fossil fuel sector are transferable to working in the renewable energy sector. There are many of the same skills, and those workers, if properly trained, will be the beneficiaries of it in the next economy. But once again, it comes down to whether you have governments with vision or whether you have governments in the pockets of the fossil fuel lobby that are just wanting to take the path of least resistance and the most campaign contributions. As far as the carbon tax, I think Australia, like many other countries, have designed climate policies that have not been based on a polluter pays principle and have offloaded too much of the burden onto consumers. And people reject policies like that, especially during times of economic crisis, when they see that it's simply not adding up. On the one hand, they feel like they're paying more for their energy, and on the other hand, they see that nobody is saying no to the fossil fuel companies. They're in the middle of a boom, and it flies in the face of justice.
But isn't it inevitable that with any polluter pays system that it ends up getting passed on to the consumers through price rises?
Well, I don't think it is inevitable. I think that that a carbon tax is a particular way where it's guaranteed to be passed on to the consumer. You could have there's a proposal right now for what's being called a climate risk bonds, where at the point of extraction, the companies would have to put a specific amount of money into a fund for us to fight climate change. And they, by the way, can be forbidden from passing these costs on to consumers. That too can be regulated. And I think we have all been indoctrinated in this idea that our governments are helpless in the face of market forces, when in fact we know when they want to intervene in the market, when it is in the interest of large corporations, they can and do intervene. We certainly saw that during the banking crisis. So it's a particular ideology that has guided the way we've responded, and that is this belief that we have to design policies in a way that will get the polluters on board from the beginning.
What about the divestment movement? Last month, the Rockefeller family decided to withdraw its funds from fossil investments. The Australian National University is dumping its coal mining stocks. Will the divestment movement make any difference?
Well, I think there's been a lot of movement on fossil fuel divestment just in the past few weeks. Glasgow University just a couple of days ago announced that they were divesting from fossil fuels, the first university in Europe to do so. Stanford University, a huge endowment, has announced that it's divesting from coal. Most significantly, perhaps, the Rockefeller family and its foundation, a name absolutely synonymous with oil. The founders of Standard Oil, which later became Mobil, which is now ExxonMobil, have announced that they're divesting their holdings. And I think the Rockefeller case is particularly interesting because when they made this announcement, Valerie Rockefeller said that it's precisely because her family's money comes from fossil fuels that she feels a moral responsibility to fund the transition. And essentially she was articulating that polluter pays principle. But the real trick is to get at Exxon's $45 billion in profits in a single year, which remains the highest profit ever reported by a single company. So it has to be about more than divestment, but I think what divestment does is it's starting to delegitimize this sector. I mean, we also had news just this week that Lego is severing its relationship with Shell, a long-time relationship, because it was targeted by Greenpeace with the message that we don't want our kids being advertised to with fossil fuels. So these fossil fuel companies are becoming not just, they were already toxic, but now they are becoming toxic politically.
Many climate change skeptics believe that climate science has been exaggerated by people that they refer to disparagingly as watermelons, people who are green on the outside but red on the inside. Well, the fact that you, a long-term critic of the capitalist system, has now written this book, will that just give the skeptics further ammunition to doubt the science?
I don't think we need to worry too much about the climate deniers, to be honest. I think they're pretty dug in. This is what they believe, and they believe this because they understand that if climate change is real, and I have spent a lot of time with the climate deniers. I have a chapter about them in the book. I've interviewed many of the most prominent members of this particular clique, and they're really honest that they first understood that if the science was true, and this was said to me by the head of the Heartland Institute, the premier climate change denier institution, Joseph Bast, said that he realized that if the science was true on climate change, then it would mean that leftists would be able to do whatever they wanted. This is what he said to me. And he said, so I took another look at the science in order to find holes in it. In other words, the political implications of the science were unacceptable to him. Because if it is true that industrialization is destabilizing our planet's life support systems, then obviously you need to regulate. Obviously you need to intervene. Obviously the idea that greed is good and it is the best way to deliver the best possible outcomes for the most number of people, well, that cannot stand up to what our climate scientists are telling us. So it's created a crisis on the far right, and it really doesn't matter what I say because they believe this already. And I actually think they understand something about climate change that a lot of liberals still are themselves denying, which is that responding to this crisis requires an ideological transformation.
Naomi Klein, we've run out of time. Thanks very much for joining us.
Thank you.